And we're started. Thank you so much for joining today, everybody. Today we're coming together as pension divestment campaigners to learn about the pensions review. Some of you may be very familiar with it already. Some of you may just be hearing about it for the first time now. It's okay. That's why we're coming together. I'm going to discuss what it is, what opportunities it brings, what challenges the review poses for us. And what we're trying to do today is go through what we could win, what we could lose, learning more about it before moving into some wider discussion about what the campaign opportunities are. If you can, just post in the chat where you're calling from and what you're seeking to get out of today. That'd be great. Be great to hear from as many of you as possible. If you're having any issues or any questions or any access needs or any technical things that people say that you don't know what they mean, please feel free to use the chat. We have lots of people that know what they're talking about on this call, and I'm sure one of them will respond to you in the chat shortly after. I'm going to fairly swiftly move us on to the presentations, and with that, I'm going to pass over to Marloes from Finance Innovation Lab, who can introduce themselves and give us an overview of what the pensions review is, before moving to Andrew Finney from Fossil-Free Oxfordshire, who has, as I'm sure you are familiar with, been campaigning on divestment for a really impressive amount of time, who's going to focus more on what the implications are for LGPS specifically, and some of the work that he coordinated at the start of this year and the back end of last on our collective response as a network to the consultation on the mega fund reform. Over to you, Marloes.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, press the wrong button as always. 1 second. Okay, can everyone see that? Brilliant, great. So first I just want to say hi, everybody. It's brilliant to speak to so many divestment campaigners. It's making my heart pound a little bit. So as Rob said, I'm Marloes and I work for a charity called the Finance Innovation Lab. We are trying to transform the financial system to overcome social, economic and environmental injustice. And there's lots of ways you can try and change a system, but the way we go about this is trying to change the rules of the game for finance. And that's because the sector is so shaped by policy, regulation and law. If you haven't come across our work before, we'll share a link in the chat so you can find out a bit more about our work. And you'll see on our website that one of our main priorities is pensions reform. And that's, of course, the topic of today's meeting. So I'm just going to share first a couple of slides about what the pensions review is at a high level, and then a few slides on what it means and what's really at stake. So cut to the chase. The pensions review is a once in a generation opportunity to tackle the UK's pensions crisis. It's the biggest reform of the UK's private pension system in 2 decades. So it covers all private pensions, local government schemes, defined benefit, defined contribution, and more. And it's a really politically important set of reforms. That's because they're at the heart of the government's economic agenda to mobilise private investment for, I'm sure you've heard Rachel Reeves talk about it, growth, growth, growth. And the government's very interested in pensions because they obviously hold a lot of money, over 2 trillion. And perhaps surprisingly, very little of that is actually invested in UK companies and UK infrastructure, so just 4%. And so the government's looking to change that. But the interest is not just in what pension funds invest in, it's also on adequacy. That sounds a bit technical, adequacy, but it's referring to the question of how much people have when they retire. And the outlook is not very good. So by the government's own estimate, nearly 40% of people are not saving enough to retire. So that's over 12 million people who are going to retire and not be able to afford their bills, their food, etc. And that number is likely to be an underestimate. So that's what the pensions review is about. So how does it work in practice? Well, the government kicked off a big process of reform last summer, just after they were elected. The first part of the review is known as phase 1, and that has moved very quickly. It's actually set to be complete this spring. And I think it's fair to say it's been more about demonstrating government action on growth, as opposed to being a really serious policy reform process. But that's by no means the end of our opportunity to influence the government on pensions reform, because there'll have to be a bill that makes any proposals legal in, we think, spring, summer this year. And then following that, the government's also committed to the phase 2 of the pensions review, which is expected to be bigger, broader, and longer. It could take a couple of years. So I can share a little bit more on the process in the second part of the call, but I'll just move now on to what I think is at stake with the pensions review. So, as I mentioned, the UK has a big pensions crisis. There's the issue of adequacy, that we are going to see a majority of people retiring without enough to live on. This problem gets worse for some groups of people. So, for example, people of colour on average have a private pension pot that is less than a third of white British people. And this is an issue I'm sure many of you on the call are very aware of, but far too much of our pension fund money is invested in destructive assets for our environment. So Make My Money Matter estimate that 300 billion is driving deforestation, and 88 billion is in fossil fuel companies. What's on the table? So what's the government so far proposing to do about all this? Well, I've listed a few proposals here and I'll just run through them. But I think, in brief, they have proposed some sensible steps, but it's nowhere near enough to address the crisis that I've just outlined. And these proposals also pose some serious risks for tackling climate breakdown and overcoming inequality. So you might have heard about the mega funds. Andrew's going to talk about that in more detail in a moment. You might have heard about the proposal for surplus release. I'll briefly describe that now, but if you want to find out more, we can discuss it. So this relates to defined benefit funds, which are an older model of pension scheme run through employers. And in a defined benefit scheme, retirees there's a commitment to pay a certain amount of money out to people when they retire. And some of these funds are currently doing very well. They have more money than they need. And so the government is looking to enable the funds to give money back to employers. We don't yet know what employers would use that money for, but it could, for example, be to help other employees have better pensions, which would be a good thing, or it might be to invest in new AI technology for the firm, which could get rid of jobs. We don't know. It could be a range of things. The government's also looking at mandation. So this is where the government could say to pension funds, you have to invest 5% of funds in UK startups, or 5% of your money in UK infrastructure, which could also be an airport or a nuclear power plant. On the adequacy side, the government is looking to raise the amount that you and your employer contribute to your pension each month a bit. That's probably a step in the right direction, but not enough. Some people say that it needs to be at least 15%. And I think it's worth noting that this step could see the whole pension system grow significantly. So there'll be even more money doing potentially good or bad things. And then, yeah, there's some proposals around expanding auto-enrolment and growing collective schemes, which have some pros and cons as well. Just moving on because of time. Just to sum up, really, what could we win or lose through the pensions review? So we are definitely going to see significant change in pensions over the next few years. I think the question is, are we going to use that as this rare opportunity as a chance to campaign for divestment across the whole system? Or do we just step back and risk the system becoming even bigger, even less accountable, and drive further climate breakdown and inequality and poverty? I'll pause there. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and overview of both what this is and that very helpful, provocative question of what the opportunity is and what we can do here. Look forward to speaking in the second half of this call about what those campaigning opportunities are and discussing how we organise together as a network to, as Diane says, grab the moment. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Andrew. Andrew, I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to Andrew. For those of you that don't know, some of you will know Andrew well. Andrew's been an active member of Fossil Free Oxfordshire for over 10 years and a member of the Oxford County Council Pension Fund Committee's Responsible Investment Working Group for over 2 years. Andrew's a software engineer and a member of Southwest Action on Pensions, a divestment campaign that I see some other faces that are part of on this call as well, that covers the Brunel Pension Partnership pool since swap started a few years back. Andrew, as I said earlier, assisted UK Divest. Well, actually, he just led on this. It's very generous that he said assisted, he just led on it in drafting the UK Divest response to the UK government's consultation earlier this year, and is going to do a brief overview of what the impact and opportunities are for LGPS specifically, as that's historically what our network has campaigned on. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides? Hang on, there. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the LGPS reform and the brief bio. So these slides are mainly, the actual text on the slides is mainly focused on what the actual reforms are. I haven't, my thinking about what we could be campaigning for and what the risks are and stuff is evolving, and I'll kind of just do that verbally. Okay, just so you understand the sort of structure of this. So yeah, so I'll just go over the scope and the process of the reform, and then talk about how the reforms will affect various aspects of how the LGPS operates. I don't really have time to talk too much about exactly what the current structure is. I just assume that you kind of know the basic outline. The one piece of jargon I will say is AA stands for administrating authority. So it's like a Shire County, for example, that oversees its own pension and the pension of local government in that area. So the scope. So these reforms, as far as are certainly under the consultation, only cover England and Wales, and it's all kind of kicked off when this Mansion House speech on the 14th of November, and when there was a interim report and consultations published. And the consultation ended on the 16th of January. We submitted one as as was just talked about, there was a Divest UK submission for that. So the next steps are for the authorities and the pools to propose how they'll operate, and they need to do that by the beginning of next month. And the plan is apparently to have everything up and running by the 1st of March of next year. So I'm just going to go through the various changes that were proposed by the government. So the one area which I hope luckily isn't changing particularly, at least from the perspective of the Brunel partnership. So basically the government is expecting the authorities to define the ESG and RI policy for their assets. But however, they expect them to reach consensus at the pool level. So certainly as far as Brunel operates, this doesn't really change anything. And it, especially when for a pool like Brunel, where the majority of assets are being invested by the pool, it really doesn't make an enormous amount of difference. The main area of risk here is how, when, as I discuss, as things get pooled more, and I'll talk about that in later slides, but the key thing here is there a conflict between the fiduciary duty of an authority to, let's say, decide how they want to divest? How does that isn't that going to get conflicted when that fiduciary duty is kind of tries to reach some kind of consensus at the pool level? So to give that a bit more of a concrete idea, is there are some very conservative authorities in the Brunel region, but there's also relatively liberal ones. Probably the most liberal one would be Avon, probably, and those have completely different ESG and RI policy positions versus climate risk, and they don't agree on how their assets should be managed with respect to that risk. And it's not clear how the fiduciary duty is supposed to be resolved between those two. So that there's a risk, and that's something that we should be pointing out as part of our kind of ongoing response to this process. So so the main, and this is the key part, the sort of headline, is that the pools will manage all the assets of an authority. At the moment, and it varies a lot, is anything from about like 40% all the way up to almost like 80 to 90%. Instead of having that range, it will all be sort of 100% managed by the pool. So the problem with that is that if those authorities that are managing some of those assets themselves can manage those in a way that addresses their approach to responsible investment, whereas when it moves up to the pool, they have to work within this responsible investment consensus, right? So and then the other aspects of management is that the pools it's not completely clear how strict this is, but the sort of the direction in which I think the government wants the pools to operate is that they manage their assets in-house, and they don't go to private markets, or they don't offload the fund management to third parties. And that's quite a big change for a pool like Brunel, which tends to manage everything outside. They don't actually do the day-to-day management. They outsource it. Now, actually, I think this is a positive, because it reduces the number of the Chinese whispers that happens, and actually there's less excuses that can be made with respect to responsible investment and divestment policy. It's not a question, oh, well, we can't find anybody to do this for us. If they're managing it in-house, then they've got no reason why they can't do it, if you see what I mean. so the other big the other big change is around how authorities can manage their assets. Under the current system, there's no reason why an authority can't sort of pick and choose what sort of sub funds or investment vehicles that the pools provide to implement their policies, including their ESG and responsible investment policies. So, for example, at Brunel, Oxfordshire have decided to use a Paris-aligned benchmark fund for their equities, and they can choose how much goes into that fund. They can choose to invest in a sustainable fund. They can choose which they've done, and they've also, you know, choosing to move their UK equities into a FTSE 250 based fund, which reduces their exposure to the large fossil fuel majors like Shell and BP. So now all that flexibility is going to be taken away. At least that's based on what was proposed in the consultation. Basically, they will just, you can see this on the left hand, on the right hand side, this table is basically the kind of form that when authorities do their strategic asset allocation, this is the kind of information that they provide. So that all they can do is sort of say, right, we want this amount of our investments to be in equities, without any kind of control over what kind of distribution of risk or what that investment is going to be. And it's not completely and the implication is, based on the rest of it, is that the responsible investment policy that is consensus is kind of sort of spread across this. And in practice, this is kind of really problematic for Oxfordshire, for example, where all those choices that have been made over quite a long period of us campaigning, and the slow, you know, a slow but gradual process of kind of moving to lower risk, lower climate risk assets, that is all kind of going to go away, and you're kind of like in this kind of shared portfolio, which is all just controlled by consensus. And again, reiterating, it's difficult to see if an authority feels its fiduciary duty requires them to reduce climate risk. It's not completely clear exactly how they're supposed to implement it if this power is taken away from them. Another area where there were changes, which is kind of possibly less contentious but probably needs to be looked at, is that on the plus, which is not, in practice, I don't know how many authorities it actually affects, because I think most authorities do actually have an independent advisor, but it's going to be mandatory for them to have an independent advisor. And they can also challenge the advice that comes to the pool. But the kind of flip side is that the authorities must take their primary advice, apparently, from the pool. So I think the model, I think it's not actually not particularly clear, but I think the model is basically they're mainly listening to the pool, but the investment advisor can kind of challenge that and chip in, if you see what I mean. But it's not particularly clear. And I think there's the big risk here is that the pool there's conflicts of interest, because you know, quite clearly the normal way that advice is given in investment terms is the provider doesn't give the advice. You have somebody else who's not providing the investment vehicle giving you the advice, because, you know, the provider of the investment vehicle can just say things that are kind of convenient from the perspective of actually delivering the vehicle, and not you know. And so, for example, in a kind of concrete sense, if the pool decides that it doesn't, either because it's difficult or because ideologically they don't like investment, then they will advise against divestment, even though there is absolutely no reason why that's a problem for the authority or for the pool, in fact. So there are some risks around that. pools and oversight. So again, this is a possibly minor, but it will affect some authorities, some pools. The pools must be investment management companies. I think this is generally a good idea, so that they're properly regulated. Another positive is that the pool boards must have 1 or 2 representatives from the authorities. So this means this means I hopefully, and this is something we should campaign on and make sure we gets nailed on, is that these will be political representatives. So I think what they mean by the shareholder, so the idea is, for example, in Brunel, there's an oversight committee which is consists of politicians from all the authorities in the pool, and that committee, that oversight board has a chair, and I think the basic idea is that that chair and probably the vice chair would sit on the board of the pool, rather than just having a kind of more separated involvement in the running of the pool, which I think generally is a good thing, gives us more kind of leverage as campaigners. And finally, something that I initially didn't really look that hard at because it didn't seem to be about investment, but something that I'm increasingly concerned about actually is the proposals for local investment. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about this, about basically the authorities need to kind of basically have plans about how they want to do local investment, and they must work with local government in their area to decide what kinds of opportunities are available. Possibly one of the sort of saving graces of this is that the pool makes the final decision on whether to invest. And also pools need to develop the capacity to check out these local investments. And that, and also this final point is that the AAs must report. I think they get the general gist of this is there will be pressure on the authorities to actually do this local investment. So I think for me, the clear risks are that this could lead to local investment in carbon intensive infrastructure and other kinds of high impact environmental investments. And it's not clear to me that at the moment, all the RI, the responsible investment and ESG infrastructure within, not infrastructure is the wrong word, the kind of expertise is orientated around understanding the risks of things like equities and bonds, and not so much about, it's really slowly evolving about how to handle things like infrastructure. And one of the dangers here is that if that expertise doesn't get developed quickly enough and integrated into the pool's oversight mechanism, they won't be able to do appropriate due diligence on local investments of carbon intensive infrastructure. And just to be clear, what I'm talking about is things like runways, motorways, even a coal mine, So I think what we need to do is be campaigning for there to be work on making sure that if they're going to do this, that they introduce the appropriate ESG oversight mechanisms, and also kind of highlight how, and also go into a bit more detail about how other authorities within a pool can have control over whether these investments even happen. So hopefully that's given you an overview. I've kind of gone over the processes. I didn't put a slide with the sources on. If you need them, just get in touch. And yeah, so there's going to be changes. There's no real change normally there's no change on the ESG and RI, but there is in terms of fiduciary duty. There's changes on what the authorities can do in terms of allocating their assets, the scope of the investments by pools is increasing to 100%, and they're probably going to be forced to bring their investment in-house. And then there's this kind of strange kind of idea about the pools giving advice to the authorities, and possible conflicts. And then we have this final thing of the risk with local investment. So that's it. Thank you. Anyone?
Thank you so much, Andrew. second time in a couple of months that you've given this to our network. So very appreciative of your expertise and your time, especially. We're going to move now to just doing a little bit of Q&A, but focusing specifically on what the review is, and whether there are any clarification questions that folks have about the presentations that we've just heard from, before moving in the latter half to the thing that we're all excited about, which is what do we do about it? So there have been a few questions in the chat. I'm actually just going to go to those people live to read out their question. If you can just say who you are and where you're calling from before asking your question. So I'm going to go to Owen first, as I think that Joan, your question has been answered. So Owen Espley, over to you. If Owen's here. Have we lost Owen? No, Owen? All right, we may have lost Owen, so I'm going to read Owen's question out and go to Marlus or Andrew to answer. Consensus, do we know what that will mean in practice? Big difference between needing consensus to invest in X versus consensus to apply a responsible investment approach in practice. I think this was asked during your presentation, Andrew, so might be one for you to go to.
Yeah, I think the way it sort of works at the moment, and I better be careful what I say, is that, for example, with what consensus means is in practice is, let's say you want to invest, you want to have something approaching a divestment policy. So you might say, we will exclude fossil fuel companies that have, let's say more than 10% of their assets invested in fossil fuel reserves, right? You might say that, right? That might be a rule that you want to apply to the portfolio. Now, what the consensus is that rule would apply to the whole pool. All the authorities would have that applied to their portfolios, right? That's what consensus means. It means arriving at that rule across the whole pool. So all the authorities. So that can be quite challenging if you're in, say, the Brunel pool, because you've got people like Buckinghamshire, which is, a Tory authority, which has a relatively conservative view on these things, all the way through to Avon, which has quite aggressive sort of goals for achieving net zero by 2040, and which is ahead of everybody else, and as generally want to kind of get out of these kind of things. So that's what consensus means.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I'm going to follow up with a question from Nick on that's again related to your presentation, Andrew. Just a practical one on AA reps so administering authority reps on pool boards, 1 or 2 in total, or from each administering authority.
It's 1 or 2 in total. So, Brunel would just have 2 new board members, which would be the chair and the vice chair of their oversight committee, or at least that's kind of roughly what I'm anticipating how it would work.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Nick, for the question. I'm going to go to Bill Spence now. Bill, if you'd like to come off mute and ask your question. Thanks.
Thanks very much for organising this. I just wanted to raise something that Andrew mentioned. I think that some local funds have been very successful in getting divestment to happen, and I wondered if there was evidence that this has had no negative impact financially on those funds, and if that would help persuade pool funds to come to a really positive decision on divestment rather than the opposite.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah,
Go for
that's
it.
quite a big question. I'm trying to think what I think what you can, I think, I don't know whether we can the data is out there to actually sort of demonstrate this divesting authority is done better than this non-divesting. I mean, what you can do, which is much easier to do, is just compare the performance of portfolios that exclude and don't exclude. And the short term, it's difficult to persuade people possibly over the short term. So like the last couple of years because of the Ukraine situation. But if you look at the sort of 10 to 15 year trend, is you can see that actually being excluded actually gives you a little bit, but it's not a huge amount. It's like a tiny amount actually, but you're never worse off. You're definitely not worse off. And in fact, there's been research where people have gone back over long time scales and tried to do what you kind of call a sector-wide, knocking out each individual sectors across a portfolio, taking one out at a time and seeing what the historical effect would be. And actually, it never makes a significant difference. So I think what I would suggest, if you're going to use it as a campaign argument, is if you do make that argument that it doesn't make much difference, don't emphasize that it's in the sort of 10 to 15 year time frame. Don't try and avoid getting into an argument about what happened over the last 2 or 3 years, because I know that certainly in the Brunel pool, there's been a bit of an argument about people like Buckinghamshire have been arguing that they've been kind of done badly because they've been out of, they've had less fossil fuel exposure, and they haven't done so well because of that. But that's only I think the important thing is to emphasize that this is long-term investment, because it's a pension investment. You're not expecting the pool to operate like a hedge fund, or at least that's my understanding of how pensions should work.
Thank you, Andrew. Certainly can't retire on a planet on fire. I think one thing that I'm going to say, Marlus, unless you would like to come in here, I would pivot to, and certainly to the question of, can we share this research? Yes, I think Andrew is referring to Grantham Institute research, and there are some good links that I can provide on going onto different stock exchange websites and comparing the comparative performance of an index that has everything and one that excludes fossil fuels, and you can see that they track pretty much the same, if not slightly better in the long range. I'm going to pivot because I think there's a connection here to Tony's question on what the prospective benefits of pooling can be for divestment, thinking specifically here about disinvestment as opposed to divestment, which whereby policies taken by Oxford actually is a good example, Andrew, in terms of adopting the Paris-aligned benchmark for Brunel a number of years ago, and London Civ is another, whereby one council pushing for a specific policy has actually led to other pensions in that pool doing the same, which has led to a reduction of investment overall in London that leads to an average of about 2% invested in fossil fuels across the London Civ, comparative to 4% nationally. Brunel is not quite at that level, but has similar benefits of adopting a policy pushed for by one council that can get adopted at a pool-wide level. But I'm going to ask, Jesse's given quite a nice comprehensive answer about how we will all become Ontarian teachers fairly soon. But just to this broader question of, why do we want pools in the first place? Is it political? Is it financial? What's the benefit of that? I might go to Marlus on that first, unless Andrew, you have something that you'd like to add as well. Our other speakers and our other guests that may know about this or have things to offer on this, feel free to come in as well. Who wants to go first? Marlus, Andrew?
Go ahead, Marlus.
Well, I'll just reiterate what my colleague Jessie said, really. But I mean, the primary motivation, I think, for everything the government's doing right now is investment and growth for the short term. So there's a hope that having bigger pools of funds would mean that there's capital to invest in longer term projects and in more infrastructure. But I don't know that there is a lot of evidence that will actually happen. And then there are some arguments that pooling can raise the standards of, say, the governance of pension schemes and reduce inefficiencies. But again, I think the evidence there is mixed. There was a DWP report recently which found that consolidation actually led to reduced, or there was no increase in pensioner benefits in terms of the governance side of things. Yeah. And I will just do a shout out for my colleagues, Jessie and Nick. They both joined the call. Jessie's got a specialist policy hat and Nick has public campaigning experience. So it'd be great if they're able to contribute to the discussion and questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, we welcome all kinds of hats in this meeting. Andrew, did you have anything you wanted to say to that before we move on to any further questions?
No, that's fine.
All right, thank you. I'm just going through our questions here. What do we have next? We've got one from Leslie. Leslie, I know you're on your phone, so I'm just going to read this out for you if that's okay. Local investment, what if the pool is not totally geographic, as in the case of borders to coast, which includes Surrey, but not Durham, for example? How do we define what local is if the pool is not arranged in a local form? Andrew, I think that would be one for you.
Yeah, this is a point we actually specifically called out this issue with border and coast in our response to the government, and it is a problem. I don't know is the answer how you define locality. I mean, I think it's difficult. It's difficult to. It's inevitable with that. If that pool didn't change, then it's inevitable that most of the local investment would end up being in the north, and poor old Surrey stuck down there would be struggling to actually. I mean, obviously, it's possible that you could have investments that would be in Surrey that would be invested by authorities in the north. There's no reason why that couldn't happen, but the point is, it's not if those authorities would be looking for all the social benefits of their investments as well as the actual financial benefits, which would be all they would get if they were investing down in Surrey. So, you know.
Thank you, Andrew. With respect to our Surrey pensions campaigners that I think are on the call today, poor old Surrey was definitely not on my bingo card for today's event. We will move on to thank you, Olwyn, for a really great point around looking to the Netherlands. We are hoping to do a webinar on that subject for UK Divest with some Dutch pension activists in the coming months, which should be really great to learn from their experience. I'm going to move to Alex's question. Alex, I can either read this out or we'll go to you. If you don't jump in to speak, I will read it out for you.
Well, I mean, Andrew, in particular, you mentioned there's doubt about what infrastructure it might go into, motorways or coal-fired power stations or anything like that. Nuclear power stations. Hopefully, we're not seeing any more coal-fired power stations, but anything like that. Surely the government should be cross-referencing some of its other commitments that are out there. Is there a void in that respect, and the whole thing is left completely open for interpretation by pools when investment propositions come before them? Can you say any more about that?
Yeah, it's not obvious. It's certainly a consultation document didn't appear to link any national policy, which would be in Miliband's sort of ballpark, about sort of general approach to energy production, for example, was not mapped in. There was no mechanism where the national government can intervene. I guess where if there was national government intervention, I guess it would be through the sort of strategic planning and strategic infrastructure planning, but that would just be kind of layered on top of it. There's no kind of strategic input into the local investment. So this is possible. This is a part of the risk area. There wasn't apart from this kind of ESG consensus mechanism, there's no kind of there's no ring put around what those local investments should be, as far as I can understand, in the proposals themselves, right? But there may be, like I said, I guess, You know, if Manchester wants to develop a runway, then it has to go through all the normal planning processes. But that's about as far as it goes in terms of the constraints. You know, it basically would then just be, does the pool have an ESG policy that excludes the runway, and does it have the expertise to do it, to actually kind of figure out what the carbon impact is and actually say, yes, it is excluded.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Jesse, I imagine that you're going to speak to this question, so we'll go to you now.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize 2 points that my colleague Marlise mentioned. So the first is that this push to consolidate, to have a small number of very large pension funds, is not something the Labour Party came up with. It's a continuation of Conservative Party policy. So most of what they're doing now was started under the last government. And in fact, Jeremy Hunt has been very glowing about this government's pensions work. So I think for us, that means we can expect that this is going to stick. This is going to happen. Some version of this will happen. And there will be consolidation, and we will be dealing with a system with fewer, larger funds. And we need to reorient our minds to be thinking about how do we influence such a system, which for me, again, means in addition to thinking about how do you influence larger funds, that the rules that those funds have to follow, set by the government, should become much bigger focus of our campaigning. And this is where the pensions reform now is really worrying, to Alex's point, is that the government, is rushing through these ideas because it can see some kind of growth benefit, but has not mentioned the environment or green objectives at all, as far as I've seen, in any of their plans to reform the pension system. So we are facing the biggest change in pensions system for 20 years, and probably the only one we'll get to influence in our campaigning lifetimes. And at the moment, green is not there. And so if we don't do something, we're going to lock in a lot of the bad problems.
Thank you, Jesse. Sorry, Marlise, go for it.
And maybe it's interesting for people to hear that even a number of industry players were surprised that green and net zero, clean energy superpower mission were not part of the pensions review, and have actually been pushing for that. So it's been a shock to a number of different stakeholders.
Thank you for that. And I think with this question, we're fully going to pivot into the second half of what do we do about this. But I am going to go to Joan for your question, Joan. As we have some Scottish people on the call, Joan, can I also ask you? I'm aware that you're arranging some demo in about a month's time for PLSA. I wonder if you want to also just shout that out here or in the chat so that some of the Scottish people on the call might be able to join you there. For those that don't know what I'm just referring to, Joan will enlighten you shortly. Joan.
Yeah, hi folks. Just quickly, there's a annual pension investment conference that's run by the PLSA, which has happened in Edinburgh for the last few years. This year it's on the 11th to the 13th of March. So we are planning a number of climate groups in Edinburgh to do a demo outside on the morning of Wednesday the 12th. We have done a similar thing the last 2 years. This year we're going to be very much focusing on drawing attention to the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries report on planetary solvency, leafleting the delegates as they go in and trying to have conversations, about 800 delegates usually, from all across the UK. So, and that then dovetails into my question, which was just about this report, which to me seems such a valuable piece of ammunition in any sort of campaigning where the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, in conjunction with University of Exeter, are pointing out the enormous unrecognised risks that pension funds are running. It's obviously across all policy making, but it applies to pension funds as well. Yeah, I think I don't know. I don't know if I'm asking a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Joan. In the interest of time, I'm going to cap us and move on to talking about the opportunities, but I think I wanted to make sure that we had a question relating to climate risk in here, because I think that's an example of something that we've come together to campaign on in the past, and also need to do more urgently in the future. So I'm going to go to, we were going to have a slight break, but I'm actually going to encourage you to, if you need a break, to take one for yourselves, and catch up on the recording if you need to. And instead we're going to pivot now into the what do we do about it section of today's call, as we've started doing so anyway. So Marlous, I'm going to hand back over to you, because I think some of the questions that you have for what the opportunities this presents and the provocative questions for us are really useful to guide our discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I've learned a lot already on the call as well, so thanks everyone for your input. I'll just share my slides again. Can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay, so opportunities of influence. I'm going to just share some slides and thoughts on the barriers that we need to overcome, how the divestment movement can help achieve that, and some more details about the reform process that needs influencing. And I also want to just start with some good news. So there are a number of other people in the UK who are thinking about the pensions review alongside all of you. There's a growing alliance of civil society organisations, charities, unions, and even some parts of industry who are working on a shared agenda for change. And on a high level, the demands that we're coalescing around are that the pensions review delivers decent pensions for everybody, it helps fund a just green transition, and that any destructive investment, including in fossil fuels, is phased out. I mean, none of these are obviously a given. We're going to have to work hard to achieve them. But I think it's fair to say that 1 and 2 have a fair amount of broad support for them. And that the third, phasing out destructive investment, is the most out there still and really needs more efforts behind it to make it politically possible. In terms of the types of skills organisations involved in this work have, I'd say they're more on national advocacy side, on the research side, and there are big gaps in public campaigning and grassroots organising. So the divestment movement is really, really well placed to help fill that gap. I'm just going to run over some of what I think are key barriers to bringing about change. There will be more, I'm sure. The first is that obviously the Treasury and the Chancellor have a very narrow focus on short-term growth. This is driving, disappointing decisions like the recent announcements on Heathrow and Rosebank. This means that phasing out fossil fuel investments in pension funds isn't going to be high on her priority list. The government also has very close ties with the city, and there are parts of the city that are going to be very resistant to any ideas about what they should be doing with their money, or how it might reduce their profits in the short term. I'm sure you've come across lots of arguments on these fronts in your campaigns already. And then the third or fourth area of barriers is around public engagement. So I think the divestment movement has obviously shown just how much the public can care about pensions, but there are still lots of people we need to reach. and there's limited understanding amongst a lot of people about pensions in general. What's a state pension versus a private pension, for example, and what's the connection to climate change. And another issue is that most people are facing cost of living challenges now. The thought of dealing with costs in 30 years' time, might not be the priority compared to putting food on the table tonight. So in our campaigning, I think we need to be really mindful of these barriers. And there are different ways that you might try to overcome them. And I think as an alliance of organisations, we can try different and complementary approaches. But I thought I could suggest some thoughts about what these might mean for the divestment movement. I think on the first, there's a real need and opportunity to show that there is significant public support and pressure for the government to go beyond this conception of growth. We need to show that the public care about all the other things they committed to in their manifesto, for example, on climate, on clean energy. And we need to demand that, based on the conversation we just had, we need to demand that any talk of infrastructure or investment in infrastructure is connected to the green parts of their industrial strategy, which is in development. And politicians need to be hearing about this public concern through a variety of channels. People need to turn up at their constituencies, they need to get it on social media, they need to hear about it in the mainstream media, and so on. And they need to feel worried about their election successes, and they need to be worried about their promotion opportunities in the future as well. In terms of the industry resistance, I think we need to be really prepared with counter arguments. So I expect people will say, oh, well, if we divest from fossil fuels, that's going to reduce people's pensions. But I think in the long term, we can show differently. And we can also say, well, it's not just about people's retirement incomes. What about the general life in 30 years if we continue on the current rate of climate breakdown? What was the phrase you used earlier, Rob? No retirement in a burning planet.
You can't retire on a planet on fire.
Exactly.
Yeah. All day for these lines.
And then finally, we need to bring the broader public with us. So we need to help educate them about all these issues, and we need to translate our concerns into terms that feel really important and urgent to people's everyday lives today. So I'm just going to go over a rough timeline for the review process. And we can update you as we learn more, but I do want to say we probably are dealing with some uncertainty because there is a bit of political upheaval at the moment. But the first moment we're expecting relevant to the review is the report, the final report of phase 1 in probably end of March. So the Treasury will publish a report. They will want to celebrate what it means for growth in the media, and that could be a really key moment from a public campaigning perspective to try and reframe the news story they want to paint, to say that actually the public aren't happy with this and we want it to be much more ambitious, and we need to be pensions reform to be linked to green outcomes. Later in kind of early summer, we're expecting the pension schemes bill to start passing through Parliament, starting in the Lords. And we expect some politicians to be willing to challenge the government on the lack of the concern for the environment in that through amendments. So, for example, there could be amendments saying that mega funds need conditionality on them so they can't invest in new fossil fuel projects. Those politicians, those allies, will be relying on public campaigning to mobilise wide political support so that other politicians vote for their amendments. They might not win those amendments, I just want to flag that, but that wouldn't necessarily be losing, because generating debate in Parliament at this point could be really good for setting us up for the debates around phase 2 of the review. And then phase 2 will be launched sometime from summer, we think, by Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions. Again, there's going to be lots of opportunities for inputting with policy and evidence. There'll be more consultations, but there'll also be all sorts of events and speeches that we could use as key moments as part of that. I just want to share some faces. So these are some of the power holders over the review. I don't know if you recognise them. So in terms of teams, I think the PM's office, Department for Work and Pensions, and Treasury are holding most of the power on the review, but it's really the Treasury who's in charge. And they're the ones that we need to convince that any concern for growth needs to be linked to the government's green commitments as well. You'll probably recognise Rachel Reeves, obviously the Chancellor, but she's supported by the City Minister, Emma Reynolds. She is based in High Wycombe, and she has just come from the lobby group City UK. She's part of the new Labour intake. And then Torsten Bell, he is the new Pensions Minister who sits across Treasury and the DWP, and he is responsible for the review. He's based in Swansea West, and it's quite interesting that he's just come from the Resolution Foundation, which works on poverty. So he is quite used to being on the side of social justice, but now has a different remit. Okay, and then finally, I just want to share some other thoughts on things that you might want to consider. I mean, you will all have brilliant ideas about what to do, so I hope this is just useful food for thought. But I think there's work that needs to be done at a national and local level. So nationally, there's value in targeting some of the national organisations like Treasury in London on generating media, on running digital campaigns. More locally, there are actually government offices we can target in the regions. It's really important that we engage our MPs, and we might be able to mobilise local authority representatives to speak out and be advocates on wider regulatory issues as well. And then just to say, like, how can we help as the lab? We would be really happy to keep sharing political intel, providing any research and policy support, and also just having catch-ups to coordinate on key moments. And maybe an idea could be something like a national day of action. I think that's helpful.
Thank you very much. Those are some really productive questions and ideas for us, and helpfully are also a bunch of things that some of which we haven't done before and some of which we have done before as a network. Definitely a day of action is something we haven't actually done on a national scale for a couple of years, but we did back in 2023, and we had protests in, I think it got up to 43 different places with over 1,500 people taking part. So we've got a good track record of being able to do that, and let's see if we can do one again. That might be something for us to consider organising. So we're now back over to kind of just all of you. For those of you that are unfamiliar with what UK Divest is, there are a couple of us, myself and Sally, I think, are on the call today, who work for organisations that help coordinate UK Divest. But ultimately, UK Divest is not us. It's the 50 plus groups of divestment campaigners around the country, some of whom are represented on the call today, that actually do the campaigning at local level, not us. So what do you want to do? What should we do to help you do that? What ideas do people have? I'm going to just, Jane, as ever, I'm sorry, this is Jane Tulis. If nobody starts speaking, I will just point to Jane and ask for Jane to speak. I'll win too. I might look at you as someone to come in, but if others don't, otherwise, we're just going to open up now. I'm going to leave kind of 10 seconds for someone to just come in with, what should we do? What are your thoughts? No bad ideas in this section of the space. Yeah, go for it. Jill, delighted to have you. Go for it.
Hi there. I really, really like the idea of a day of action. I'm on the pension board, well, currently rotating chair for Bromley Council, who have a really financially phenomenally good pension fund. So they're really not keen on pooling, but also I can't get them. I mean, I haven't got huge investments, but we can't get them to commit to divest or to even acknowledge they're a bit on the climate change delay, I suppose now, previously denial, end of the spectrum. So you get a short period where you can ask 50-word questions to pension committee. 50 words is like, that's really hard. You duck out your ands and your thus, it's ridiculous, and you get some stupid trite response. So I like the idea of a day of action, because at the moment it's just not out there. People don't like to think about the pensions anyway, because they don't like to think about retiring. And I just think it would be a really good way to push people into realizing, because people often go, what can I do? What can I do about anything to do with the climate? And they don't grasp that this is a huge way that they can have an impact by putting pressure on the pension funds. So, which wouldn't even cost them. It's like, yes, you can do something. You could do amazing stuff, and it's not even gonna, this isn't gonna cost you, and you can be a climate hero. But people don't realize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That's great. Richard, over to you.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for the meeting. It's been really brilliant for me. Thank you. 2 points. One is just seeing Jane's note in the chat about people really don't know yet what's coming down the track because of climate. That really chimed with me, because we find it on the streets. I live in a small town in Aberdeenshire, and my perception is people have no idea. My wife and I are even asked, so should we be taking this seriously? And I think that probably translates to politicians as well, because they're only like you and me. So I think part of the campaign has somehow we've got to ally with all climate campaigners, or to push a general message that this is deadly serious and coming very quickly. So there, have my speech on that. The other point was just, I saw Joan put the link in, I think, in the chat about the University of Exeter and the actuaries report on the fact that the pensions industry isn't equipped to deal with climate risks that are coming down and tipping points and all those sorts of things. The industry just hasn't got to that yet in terms of how to do it. So risks are woefully underestimated. And that's a very technical thing. So I think the more we can push that to politicians and net zero committees and pension committee boards, the member representatives of pension committees, who can then just stand up in meetings and say, the actuaries are saying we can't measure the proper risks yet about climate. The more we get that question into the dialogue, I think that will help in terms of getting some reforms that actually reflect the climate crisis that is already well underway. Enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Definitely some good points there. And I think this question of incorporating climate risk research and analysis and questions to our local committees and boards is certainly a good one. Yeah, definitely keen to hear more on that. Before we do that, however, I'm just going to note for reference, because I'm delighted that Nick is thinking exactly the same way that I was thinking, because I've literally just this morning set up an event for the UK Divest network to come together to talk specifically about this question of infrastructurally, are we well set up to campaign on this issue and the ways that we'd like to. I know lots of you on this call have experience of working both at a local level, but also with other local groups that are part of your pool. And I think that kind of setup may prove particularly generative for us moving forward to campaign together on these type of issues. So I think for the most part, I'm going to avoid us talking about that too much here, because I've just set up a space for us to do that in a few weeks' time specifically. And instead, I think I would like to, if it's okay, move to the question that Dawn asked. I've just seen Dawn has just left, unfortunately. But I think it's a good one for us to think about as we campaign. Day of action, but what next? What's it connected to? And maybe this is where hearing more from, in particular, the national advocacy charities that are on the call of how that connects into the work that you guys are doing, rather than just being something that is really nice that we've done, but doesn't necessarily collect wider work around this, as Jesse says, probably the biggest opportunity that we have for the next kind of 20 years. Yeah, how does it connect in? What does it go to? Marlous, I'm looking at you here for some additional thoughts here, but feel free to pretend I haven't asked you.
Sorry, this is how the National Day of Action could lead to.
Could link to other things that we do, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, I haven't thought it through in lots of detail, to be honest, but what I would see as being really important is just shining a light on the pensions review to the general public. We need to get more people understanding it, and then we need to build a journey from there to engage more and more people in different parts of the review and campaigning around it. The other thing is that a day of action in itself can attract media and can be one of these key pressure points that makes the politicians go, oh, hang on a minute, you know, there's actually support here for me to do something differently. Or the flip side of that is, if I don't do something differently, this could actually punish me further down the line. Perhaps, you know, I'm in a seat that has quite a lot of interest in green issues. I think Labour is concerned about green voters at the moment. So we can use it as this public pressure moment that's really missing at the moment. But others might have other thoughts to that as well.
Well, thanks, Marlous. I think I can see a hand from Claude here. So over to you.
Yes, thank you for everything. Claude, Money Rebellion in London. So we're happy to go, you know, add to the treasury and bring the message. But I was also wondering, I mean, there's parts of the UK that are being hit and that are suffering from the climate change, right? So Northampton, there are stories to be told there to bring the climate, the changing of the climate to life. And I wonder, you know, I mean, I would expect that in those constituencies, people would start to look at things very differently, unless, you know, I know like the right-wing media, you know, blames like the local governments not doing their work and stuff like that. But there must be some work that can be done there to bring the stories, you know, forward. And it's Northampton, it's Wales, I mean, there's more and more parts of the UK that are affected. And then there's a whole story around food as well. It's harder and harder to grow, right?
Yeah, totally. I think there's Alice can definitely speak to that. I empathize with that definitely. I think there's definitely things that we can do and think about ways that we can generate media coverage there as well. We've got 10 minutes left. Do we want to spend, so definitely it sounds like there's something that we can do to go away and think about a day of action, which is something that we've been thinking about internally as our team at UK Divest already, and can be in touch very shortly with some ideas for that and start working together to organize this question of infrastructurally, how do we organize to meet this challenge? We've got UK Divest space coming up to do that. I'm thinking now, are there things that we haven't covered in our discussion about what next steps are, or other ideas outside of those two that people would like to spend some of our remaining time exploring?
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm interested. So what I was thinking is our local MP's a minister, Annalisa Dobbs, and she's quite difficult to get hold of and actually see face to face, although she has turned up to joint Greenpeace Friends of the Earth meetings in the past. So what I was thinking was, my question is, what's the best time to kind of, what would be a good time frame to actually kind of try and influence her and lobby her in this process? Is it sort of now, given that I think we may have to actually really hassle her to actually even turn up, so it may even take a month or two to actually even get her to meet us. Is it a good idea to try and do that now, to try and influence, say what actually gets put into the pension scheme bill, or is it better to kind of wait and for the bill to actually start to be in Parliament and then influence it then?
Thank you, Andrew. Very good question. Start now. I like it, Diane, bringing the energy. Jesse, is this a response directly? Yeah, go for it. And then I'll go to Alice.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you work out exactly what you want to do and what you want to do, I think just the simple message that our future is in peril and the government is not talking about that when it's reforming the pension system, that's outrageous. You can carry that to any politician. And you don't obviously need to set up a meeting. I mean, most politicians will have surgeries that you can go to and meet them face to face as a constituent. So you can just turn up and deliver that. And that's a really effective tool, because the more, they're just people, politicians. They don't hear from that many people. And if a lot of them hear from individuals that they care about this, they start to think, oh, this is an important issue we should do something about. So it has been used very effectively as campaigning, just face to face at surgeries.
Yeah, our MP's a bit kind of difficult to get a hand on because she's quote unquote very busy.
Thank you, Andrew. I've just shared a link in the chat that is something that I will go away and speak to our sister campaign that's part of UK Divest's broader fossil-free pensions and fossil-free work stream with fossil-free Parliament, who have done a lot of work in the past that some of you may have been involved in considering things like mass constituency lobbies, which may prove a form of tactic that we could seek to replicate for our campaign once we're clearer specifically exactly what we're asking in that kind of one-to-one meeting. But I'm going to go now to Alice first, and then I'm going to go to Marluz, and then I think there's someone else, unless Marluz, yours was a direct response to this.
It was actually, yes.
Sorry, Alice, we'll come to you.
Thank you. Just to say that Annalisa and other politicians can also do things in Parliament before the bill starts passing. So they can ask questions of the Treasury, they can write to colleagues if they don't want to do something so public. They might be on a select committee that's relevant. They could, add these issues to the agenda of that. So there's lots that politicians can do now. And thanks for raising the fossil-free Parliament. I wonder if there's a job to look through all the politicians who engaged with that before and which of them are still in Parliament, because they might be particularly interested in supporting this work. Thanks.
My colleague Karis will be delighted that I'm adding to her job for the next couple of months without consulting with her at all here. Over to Alice.
Hi, so mine's just briefly, and it's sort of about a general direction. So because what I found in all my campaigning is that people just are not interested in pensions. And so I sort of run through all these different ideas about, how do you sort of capture, or how do you sort of grab people's attention? And so I've started thinking around this like needs-based economy. You know, what do we actually need to live well on planet Earth? And so it's really just about capturing this very simple notion about how do we move forward with the things that we actually just need, you know, to carry on living here on planet, ever-giving planet Earth. Yeah, and that's it.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I think a challenge most people on the call will be all too familiar with, I'm afraid, of both telling people what pensions are, how big they are, and why they matter. I think a perennial question for us, but also, as has hopefully been highlighted to some extent in this call, the size of that influence is something that is evident and quite yeah, there's a lot to play for. There's something to win there. So that's definitely what keeps me going. And I'm sure others on the chat might be able to offer more tips and ideas similarly of how to sustain this type of campaigning. If does anybody have anything else? Are there any other questions that we want to go to, or any other last reflections that our speakers want to share before we close? All right.
Yeah, just one kind of quick thing I just wanted to share. This is a slide share. This is a slide here. I can share this with people if they want. It's basically a comparison of net returns between NCI World and NCI World X fossil fuels between over 14 years up to August last year. I'll stop.
Thank you, Andrew. Delightful to. Sorry, Marlus, go for it.
Just to say thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm just really excited about all the energy on this call and what might happen next, and just the value in directing all of this at the pensions review and the government, who can create, you know, change at scale over the next couple of years to the pension system. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much to all of you for coming. So specifically to our speakers for their presentations, and for all of the different organizations, campaigners around the country. I think we have people from most nations and regions in the UK here tonight. No, I'm so used to it being tonight. This afternoon, that's wonderful. Next steps, we will circulate this recording and hopefully some of the slides from this. We'll be in touch as UK Divest about discussion in a couple of weeks' time about how we organise together, and we'll be in touch about a prospective day of action for that wider collaborative working with some of the partners that aren't part of UK Divest but have been on this call. I'm sure we will be in touch and discuss further prospective collaboration and reflect that over email to the network that's here today as well. So for now, though, we're going to end just 2 minutes early. I'm going to stop the recording, and thank you all so much for coming, and see you all soon. Bye.